Would you answer the simple question at the beginning? What do sociologists do?
Oh gosh, what do sociologists do? They don't do tech and they don't do business, which disqualifies me from writing a book like this. Sociologists look at how people behave. They listen to the language people use. And then they make these wild generalizations on the basis of past behavior and past observations. That's what sociologists do. As an urban sociologist, I'm kind of in my own tribe with other urbanists, whether they're geographers or architectural historians or social critics. That is, I try to interpret the physical form and the social communities as well as the cultures of cities in terms of large-scale structural changes, whether those are demographic changes like with migration and immigration, or they are technological changes like the invention of the telegraph, or the development of railroads, or the invention of computers and the commercialization of the World Wide Web. I try to understand these big changes in very micro terms. What we see, where we live, where we walk every day. That's me.
Good answer.
So, welcome. You all deserve a prize for coming out in this weather. I appreciate it. This is obviously the fruit of the past 5 years of research, a lot of interviews, about 60 people, all those interviews in New York, but also travels around the world to other cities, Shanghai, Shenzhen, China, Copenhagen, Stockholm, Scandinavia, Paris, where I was delighted to see that some of the forms of tech embedded in New York also crop up in other places. The politics are different. The particular power structure may be different. But each city is now going through this somewhat painful process of trying to deal with digital technology and the social and cultural forms of new kinds of work, less kinds of work, different ways of controlling workers, bringing capital into investment in the city, and this combination of adjustment and anxiety over control leads to what I call the innovation complex. In a Freudian sense, that is, all cities want to be centers of innovation, whatever that is, but they fear that they can't control it. So that's why I call the fruit of my research the innovation complex. But the innovation complex is also real places. It's real clusters of new industries and new businesses integrating with old power structures. That, in brief, is what my work is about. I started doing this research in 2015. I was very much interested in understanding how a new economy takes form. This is not a visual question. I apologize. This must be a very visual audience, but it's not a visual question. How does a new economy take form? As a sociologist, though, I was saved from saying, well, it's business, it's entrepreneurs. Instead, I understood this as a social and a cultural process, not just an economic process or a financial process or an organizational process. So I wanted to know, what is this new economy? How do we see it? And it seemed to me that other researchers talk about the new economy in a placeless way. To understand how a new economy takes form, you have to look at where people live and work, and not just in individual companies, but in cities. I was lucky because after 2008, new technology, digital industries moved into cities in a very big way. So my approach was very well timed, although that wasn't intentional or planned. It was well timed because this was a moment of the urbanization of Silicon Valley, when cities tried to adopt the cultural and social forms of Silicon Valley, bring them into the existing political commitments and social communities of urban life, and deal with the consequences. So that's what I've tried to look at. Very simple kinds of questions. So I was lucky to find this wonderful assemblage of detritus put together by the late Congolese artist Bodis Isek Kingale, which represents a futuristic city. And when I saw this at an exhibition of his work at the Museum of Modern Art a couple of years ago, I knew immediately this is the image that I wanted for my work. Now I have to figure out which click to push. Not this click. It's not that click either.
No, you did it. You did it.
Yeah.
Oh, it is that clip. Okay. So, by 2015, when I was seriously starting my research project, I discovered that New York City had been called by a research organization the #2 startup ecosystem in the world, after the San Francisco Bay Area. Startup ecosystem, what is this? It's a set of organizations and people that relate to each other, like animals and vegetation in a natural habitat. They relate to each other, and they survive. Some fall by the wayside, but the system survives. But this is something new for New York, because New York had gone through a lot of nasty shocks since 2000, 2001. We had the 1990s, the dot-com years, when new media firms created web content. We saw that the dot-com boom wound up in a bust of stock market values in 2000, 2001, just before the terrorist attack on the World Trade Center. You're here in 2001. And then just 7 years later, we had the nasty shock of the financial crisis of 2008. So New York started the 2000s in a very disadvantageous position as far as digital technology and investment in innovation were concerned. So somehow, between the early 2000s and 2015, New York had risen again, which always delights us New Yorkers, had risen again as #2 startup. Not so good to be #2, but at least we were in the running as some kind of physical, social, cultural assemblage that was making innovation. People look at this in two terms. One term is the number of tech jobs. So this is what this bar graph represents. The number of tech jobs rose every year from the early 2000s with a little dip in 2008, 2009, and then kept rising, keeps rising since 2008. There are different definitions of tech jobs. They can be jobs dealing with digital technology, jobs using digital technology. Somebody like me, I use Word, right, to type my book, and you could say maybe I have a tech job, even though I don't work in a tech business. So there are different ways of defining what a tech job is. The bottom number is usually 150,000 tech jobs now in New York, but other people count more kinds of jobs as tech jobs, and so they say, oh, we have 350,000 tech jobs. The other way that people talk about a startup ecosystem is in terms of venture capital investment, and you can see also a generally rising amount or volume of venture capital investment, the kind of investment that is put into tech businesses in early years. And you can see an increasing number of deals till 2015, and then a lower number of deals, a smaller volume of investment, but still a very large amount of investment. One of the things I had to learn when I was doing this research was, what is venture capital? Venture capital has a history that goes back to investment in the colonial expeditions of European countries looking at the eventual South America and North America for treasure and slave power. But modern venture capital really is born in the 1940s and much more in the 1950s and 60s, starting in the Boston area and then going out to the San Francisco Bay Area, the area that eventually became known as Silicon Valley, when investors place their money in firms using new technology or developing new technology. And the investors also placed themselves at the disposal of the founding team to give hands-on management about business, all aspects of business development. Eventually, the idea was to recover the investment, not just of the venture capitalists who organized the investment funds, but of the larger investors, sometimes the smaller investors, who placed their money with the venture capital partners. And the idea was that their smartness, their experience, their time and effort would pay off in developing a large-scale organization and scaling the business so that they could sell it in, let's say, 5 years or 10 years, either on the stock market through an IPO, an initial public offering, or they could sell it to a larger company. So, the idea was to make money, but the difference between venture capital and other kinds of investment was that the venture capitalists who led the fundraising would mentor the business founders. Okay, so we have New York with lots of venture capital investment and lots of tech jobs. When we walk around on the streets, we see evidence of the spread of digital technology, but a lot of what we see on the street involves the consumption, not the production of digital technology. Right? We've all seen the co-working spaces, the Apple store, which is not signed in the background across 9th Avenue, the Microsoft store, the Wi-Fi hotspots. But these are not places where new digital technology is produced, new products are produced. But we see these things on the streets more and more. So that if we go to the Seaport District in Boston, now called the Innovation District, we see a public meeting place with the name Innovation Hall. If we go down Varick Street to the Hudson Square neighborhood, the very neighborhood where Disney and Google are building new offices, a vast amount of new office space. We see that even Shake Shack calls itself an innovation kitchen. So the streets, and whether we notice these signs or not, the streets have come alive with digital technology. And in other cities too, as I said a few minutes ago, we see remarkably similar interiors around the world. The picture on the left I took at General Assembly in the Flatiron District. General Assembly started in 2011 as a co-working space, but the co-founders decided very quickly that they wanted to go into education. And so they got a grant from the New York City Economic Development Corporation. They used their own investment to transform themselves into a boot camp for intensive training of people to write computer code, do web design, to do all the kinds of tech work that employers want to hire people to do now. So this is a new kind of school. It can't call itself a school because it doesn't go through the accreditation process with the state, New York State in this case, that schools must go through, but it is a vocational training center, privately owned, to equip people after a rigorous selection process, to equip their students to get good jobs in tech, or to get better jobs in tech after 12 to 15 weeks of training. In Shanghai, I took this picture at an incubator, not a boot camp, not a school, but an incubator owned by Tencent, the big Chinese tech corporation. And there are a lot of different startups working in this incubator. They have the same aesthetics that you would find at General Assembly or any similar place in any other country. The white walls, the long tables, the computers set up along the long tables, the ironic signs, usually in English, sometimes in the native language also. But you find these interiors all around the world in these kinds of spaces, these new kinds of spaces, because there were not such schools or such hives of business development before the 2000s. However, I haven't mentioned a couple of elephants in the room. Capital and real estate, two terms that are very familiar to us in New York, particularly in this neighborhood of Manhattan. So we have the venture capital, we have the companies, we have the workers all trying to get some benefits from the venture investment, but maybe it's the real estate developers and the building owners who are sucking up the profits. At least that's the suggestion here. Also, in the photograph on the right, which is not ironic the way the cartoon on the left is ironic, but the photograph on the right shows the mid-market street area of San Francisco, where a lot of tech companies, about 20, 25 tech companies, have set up their headquarters in recent years, starting with Twitter. And the website from which I took that photograph, which suggests that innovation belongs in this newly developed part of the city, is actually the website of a living innovation zone set up by the urban planning department in San Francisco. So what I'm trying to suggest is that, as New Yorkers have seen time and time again, there are very close connections with the emergence of the innovation complex in cities today. Very close connection between venture capital, real estate capital, and the discourse of innovation. So you people will understand, being here at the Skyscraper Museum, that the innovation complex is all about making spaces, producing space in the city. The first kind of space is, as you might guess from something I said a few minutes ago, discursive space, the language that we use, a cultural space created by the names we give things. So that at General Assembly, when you step out of the elevator, you immediately come up against this ironic, gently ironic, painted sign, "You're here." It's very similar in form to a new painting in the lobby of the Museum of Modern Art, by the way. But again, it's a statement of presence, of immediacy, of the importance of you. You are at the center because we are the center. We, the place where you are. We are the center of something new. Also, the building at 12th Street and Broadway, when it was being renovated in the last year or two, I was very lucky to find the sign on the scaffold, the address of innovation. Exactly the same phrase that you find in Philadelphia or other cities, or in Shenzhen I found a sign on a similar construction site that said innovation changes life. All of this is just to emphasize that the language that we give to things creates a cultural space of expectation around innovation in cities. The second kind of space is organizational spaces. And here I hinted at this when I showed you the pictures from New York and Shanghai and talked about boot camps and incubators. The new places, the new events, and the new gatherings that became typical of and generative of the innovation complex were these spaces. Some of them were words that had been used before, but maybe used in a different way. And by the way, I have to say that I never know when I speak with anyone how much of this they know already and how much is new to them. I have asked my own colleagues in sociology, sad to say, I have asked my own colleagues in sociology if they know what a hackathon is, and most of them do not. They've never heard of it. A meetup, well, yeah, isn't that when, maybe you meet somebody on a dating site or something, or an accelerator, isn't that when you step on the gas? I just want to say I'm sorry if I am too elementary for you, because I just don't know what people know. So, very briefly, a hackathon is both a space and a time. It's an event that takes place overnight, where people, often young people, come to compete in teams to write computer code, to meet a challenge that is set by the organizer of the event. There are prizes, but they're usually not gigantic prizes. It's not like you win $1 million if you win a hackathon. You win a prize, but people get psychic rewards from working overnight and meeting a challenge and doing something that they love to do. It's in that way, it's like a continuation of the hackers who used to work all night in computer labs and in universities in the 1950s and 1960s. But hackathons can also be sponsored by for-profit businesses. And the challenges that for-profit businesses set the contestants is to create innovation, to create marketable products or improvements in their products that are digital products. So often people who compete in a hackathon are asked to write code to create an app that the business that sponsors the hackathon can use. Read my book if you want to go into the history of how companies like Yahoo and Facebook used hackathons in the early 2000s. So hackathons have become a fairly widespread event in the tech economy. New York has a large number of them every year. Meetups are organized events where people come to demonstrate new technology. There are different kinds of meetup organizations. In New York, a very big one has been New York Tech Meetup. At the time I went to the meetups to observe them for my research. There could be 500 or 600 people coming for an evening to watch demonstrations of new apps that people were creating. And one of the interesting rules at New York Tech Meetup was that people could not talk about business, and they could not ask for money. So they could only talk about their technology, their innovations. But people used the meetups to connect with investors and to find people whom they could hire for their founding teams. Accelerators are either for-profit businesses or non-profit businesses that have already raised a certain amount of investment capital, win places to have a very intensive 3-month, 4-month program of mentoring by a bunch of venture capitalists. The idea is that at the end of this intensive training, they will pitch to more investors for funds to continue their business. So it's kind of like the boot camp, but to raise money for founders. The venture capital offices, well, now there were a handful in the U.S. in the early 2000s. Now there are around 1,000. In New York, I'm not exactly sure. I actually tried to check today whether there are, say, 100 or several hundred venture capital offices in New York City, but let me just say that they have increased mightily over the years from 2008 to today. And pipelines, well, we know what a pipeline is. In the innovation economy, a pipeline is an educational institution. It could be a boot camp, it could be a university that trains people to take tech jobs and then connects them with employers. Would you like to sit down here, by the way? You shouldn't have to stand. Don't be afraid to come over here. There are other kinds of spaces that are both physical spaces and organizational spaces that are crucial to the innovation complex. One is co-working spaces. Now, co-working spaces, whether it's WeWork or some other brand of co-working space, they sell themselves to people as cooperative associations for networking. But what's even more important is that the leases are flexible. They can be signed for very short terms, like month by month, and businesses can expand their space or decrease their space as the need arises. So that enabled startups to get a foothold in the real estate market, which otherwise they could not afford, and the founders would have no track record, no credit record of legitimacy to sign a lease. And then new manufacturing spaces. This is a picture of New Lab, a completely rebuilt old machine building shop at the Brooklyn Navy Yard, which is both an accelerator and an incubator, as well as a very high-class co-working space for hardware and software startups. So putting manufacturing together with software development and creating a really lush space for this kind of manufacturing was another organizational and physical space that was created as part of the innovation complex. What may be most interesting to us when we walk around New York is, where is the innovation complex? And it's interesting that there are certain clusters, certain spaces where different kinds of companies cluster together with incubators and accelerators, sometimes near universities, illustrating, as you will see, connections between real estate, venture capital, and tech industries. But we don't have any, as yet, we don't have any legally designated or officially designated innovation districts in New York. This is a concept that became popular after the 2008 financial crisis as a way of surmounting the crisis, getting out of the crisis, and developing something new. I'd say that the concept kind of emerged, in my understanding. The concept of an innovation district kind of emerged from the redevelopment of docklands in London in the 1980s. The rebuilding of the waterfront in Bilbao, symbolized for many of us by the Frank Gehry design of the Guggenheim Museum, and Barcelona 2000, Barcelona 2000, another kind of redevelopment of an old waterfront district. So for me, the idea of innovation districts grew out of the redevelopment of derelict industrial and port land. But innovation district took on a much bigger reputation and really became a brand that advertised the availability of cities for tech industries. That had to be accompanied by a programmatic shift from the creative city that we've all heard about in the early 2000s. But the creative city did not create enough jobs to deal with the fallout of the 2008 economic crisis. So there had to be a shift from the creative city to a city of innovation. There had to be a change in New York City, and here's where Mayor Bloomberg was very important, because he himself personified this shift in thinking. There had to be a shift from accepting the dominance of the financial industry to promoting the growth of the tech industry. There also was a very important change in New York City government that elevated the Economic Development Corporation from a caretaker of city-owned real estate to a group of strategic thinkers. Under Mayor Giuliani, there was no economic development policy. Under Mayor Bloomberg, there was very little economic development policy until the 2008 financial crisis. And then there was a dramatic, almost a Marvel comic kind of emergence of EDC as a strategic organization. If you want to know all the details, read my book. But that was a very interesting discovery for me. So what we eventually have by 2015, and we see more and more today, is the emergence of whole districts where there are clusters of tech companies. But when we walk around on the street, we don't see them because they're inside buildings. They're inside factory buildings, they're inside the Brooklyn Navy Yard, they're inside office buildings, and the logos, except for Google's logo on 9th Avenue, or 8th Avenue, the logos are not really visible. They're very, very small. They're not, it's not like the early 20th century when you might see a company's name on top of the building. It's not like that at all. So you know that the X is where Amazon is going to build HQ2. The Brooklyn Navy Yard. Now, let me see if I can just show what this is. Okay. Well, you can probably understand that right above the name Brooklyn is the Brooklyn Navy Yard. Dumbo is over here. This area on the Brooklyn waterfront is supposed to be the second fastest growing tech hub in the United States. We're the second largest startup ecosystem, but this is the second largest, fastest growing tech hub in the United States after the San Francisco Bay Area. The Wall Street area, where we are, just a bit, a couple blocks north of where we are, has become a media center, or a tech and media center, because I don't know whether Condé Nast now calls itself a tech company, and Spotify calls itself a tech and media company. And then we have Facebook and IBM in the Greenwich Village area. We have some venture capital firms and incubators and Amazon Web Services in the Broadway corridor from Soho coming down to Canal Street. We have Google, of course, in Chelsea, and a proposed ferry line, not yet established, that would take Google employees and civilians from Chelsea down to Google's new campus in Hudson Square near Disney. And then we have the Union Square Tech Hub, also now called Zero Irving, at the foot of Irving Place on 14th Street, which is a building as we speak. It's being built now. I won't go into details about that right now, but it will be a building where nonprofit classes to train people to take tech jobs will be co-located with offices at subsidized rents for tech startups and businesses and offices at market rents for more established tech firms. At least that's the plan. And then we have the venture capitalists, who often are clustered along the old Silicon Alley of the Broadway corridor. We also have the emerging corporate tech and finance district at Hudson Yards, where Amazon is moving on to 34th Street, Facebook is moving it into Hudson Yards, SAP is already in Hudson Yards, the New York Times, of course, is at 41st Street, Microsoft has an office there, and then we have the school to train business entrepreneurs and computer engineers, Cornell Tech, in between the Queens waterfront, which may one day become a bioscience waterfront, and the hospitals on First Avenue on the Manhattan side of the East River, all creating some sort of biotech, health tech complex, maybe in the next 10 years. So this is all coming into form, but if you don't actually work in these places, you may not know that they're there. Let me talk to you just a little bit about the de facto innovation districts. So the first kind is the Silicon Alley and Dumbo kind of innovation district, where you have a big cluster of tech firms, venture capital firms, a lot of startups, not too much corporate. There's some. Facebook is on Fifth Avenue nearby. But my interpretation of them as naturally occurring districts is that startups clustered there because they were close to their clients, but the rents were low. So it's not that there was any plan to create a district or a cluster of tech firms. It happened that way for financial and logistical or geographical reasons. And when you look at it, it doesn't look like anything. Like it doesn't shriek. This is the historic center of New York's digital technology. It doesn't say that. The second kind of innovation district is what I call the Bloomfield district. It arises from nothing, although there was something on the land before. You may remember back in 2010, the Bloomberg administration offered 4 different pieces of city-owned land to any university that would make a contract with the city to develop a graduate or postgraduate engineering school to train entrepreneurial computer engineers. And both parts were very important. Computer engineers, because one of the discoveries of the Economic Development Corporation after the 2008 financial crisis was that businesses said there were not enough engineers to fill the tech jobs that would open up in New York City. The EDC held a year-long competition. It was kind of like Amazon's competition for a city that would allow the company to build HQ2, but in reverse, where the city was running the competition and was looking for a university, not a company, but a university to create a school. The other part of what I said is really important. just like Stanford did from the 1950s on, bringing students and faculty together with tech companies. The idea of this new postgraduate engineering school would be to embed trained engineers and business people in the city's legacy industries and new companies. So the school was not just going to be a training center, it was going to be a fruitful integration of business and universities. So a certain amount of private funding was raised to try to capture the lease on the publicly owned land and the $100 million of infrastructure that the city government offered. And Cornell University, in partnership with the Israel Institute of Technology, which itself is an engine of startup development in its home city, Tel Aviv, they won the bid to create a school on Roosevelt Island. They won the bid, and they chose Roosevelt Island of the 4 sites that were offered. So more private funding was raised, and of the 3 or 4 buildings that have been built since 2012 on Roosevelt Island are the Bloomberg building, funded by, the Tata Innovation Center, founded by the India-based conglomerate Tata, and the Verizon building. There's also a hotel and a dormitory. The third kind of innovation district is the reindustrializing innovation district of the Brooklyn Navy Yard, founded at the time of the Civil War, belonged to the US government until the 1960s, when it was abandoned, not useful anymore for building ships, and bought by the city government for a small amount of money. And it kind of languished for several decades. In the 1980s and 1990s, it began to attract tenants again, and its very old infrastructure began to be renovated when the Giuliani administration awarded the Navy Yard a grant. What's even more important is that the Brooklyn Navy Yard is on city-owned land, so its profit considerations are milder than it would be if it were on privately owned land, and it is managed by a nonprofit development corporation, which does not have to share its rent proceeds, its rent rolls, with the city government, with EDC. So the Brooklyn Navy Yard is in a good position to become an entrepreneurial public landlord. You want to know more? Read my book. But what's particularly interesting to me as a sociologist, and it should be interesting to us looking at the political commitments of any city government in New York, is that the Navy Yard is committed to maintaining manufacturing jobs, but upgrading them by investing or encouraging investment in computer-aided manufacturing, and by leasing some of their real estate to private developers to create amenities, both for businesses that are in the yard or will come to the yard and their workers, and for surrounding communities. So that you can see along Flushing Avenue in the front, the new food hall, where there's both manufacturing space and restaurant space for relatively small-scale food processors, starting with Russ and Daughters, which is their anchor tenant. Then there are some other public buildings along Flushing Avenue. And on the water side, maybe you can see these boxes of the new building, Dock 72, which is office space developed by Boston Properties that has co-working spaces and higher rent offices for more established firms. The Brooklyn Navy Yard now has a STEM high school to train young people to do tech jobs of different sorts. They have apprenticeships for young people who are in other high schools in the borough to learn how to do new kinds of manufacturing jobs. And they also are the base of the Brooklyn College Master's Degree Program in Film Production, which is at Steiner Studios, one of the tentpole new economic activities at the Navy Yard from 2004. And they also have the first in the United States city government-funded virtual reality, augmented reality training program or laboratory. So the Brooklyn Navy Yard is it's a very interesting place in terms of innovation, together with working arrangements with working class communities. The fourth kind of innovation district I call a fictional district because it doesn't really exist. It exists even less than the other de facto innovation districts. It includes the Brooklyn Navy Yard on the waterfront, Dumbo, and most interestingly for its origin, downtown Brooklyn. The idea for something called a Brooklyn Tech Triangle was born in the heads of leaders of two business improvement districts, Dumbo and downtown, around 2011, when they said, why is there so much tech development at the Navy Yard, and even more so in Dumbo, but we have empty office space in downtown Brooklyn? So they said, you know what, we really have to connect downtown Brooklyn with tech development. So we're going to call ourselves the Brooklyn Tech Triangle to fold downtown Brooklyn into this idea of innovation district. Of course, they were helped mightily by NYU, which at the same time was developing their acquisition of the old Brooklyn Polytechnic University downtown, which had dreams of creating some kind of tech center going back to Metro Tech in the 1980s. So NYU was at the same time independently thinking, gee, we need to make our business and engineering outpost in downtown Brooklyn. So there was an interesting merger of ambitions that came together in this fictional district called the Brooklyn Tech Triangle. Well, it started out as fictional, but then politicians started referring to it, the media started referring to it, and by 2015, it was almost real because people were talking about it. It entered the discourse of innovation. So, what do we see? Some of the things that we see outside of geography is that over the past 15 years, big tech has grown. Not just tech, not just startups, but the presence, the footprint of the big tech companies has grown, and just in the past 2 years, regardless of HQ2, is growing still. Whether we look at relatively old big tech or new big tech, we see increasing numbers of jobs in the city and increasing occupation of office space. And there's a question mark after the 14,000 Google jobs because we're not sure. Google says once we build our new campus on 1 million square feet in the old St. John's Terminal in Hudson Square, we may double our workforce, which would bring them up to 14,000 people. Spotify has a question after 1,800 jobs because they actually got a big subsidy. $11 million, they got a subsidy to lease office space in the World Trade Center. So we don't know whether they'll actually create those jobs. And now here's a brainiac kind of illustration for you. Venture capitalists like to say they invest where they are. They have their home city at heart. But what you see over time, looking at the blue space on each line on the left, is that the biggest venture capital firms in New York started in 2010 after the financial crisis with a really significant share of their investments in New York City. But if you look at that blue line on the left end of each of the firm's lines, in 2017, you'll see that's much smaller. Now, this makes sense. If you want to make money, you don't pay attention to the geography of your home base. Maybe you start with your home base, but then you expand wherever the opportunity is good. But it's interesting for us, thinking about the future of New York and the viability of the innovation complex, to see that even New York-based venture capitalists invest all over. And here's the wordiest slide, which I will not trouble you with too much, but if you want to see what is the ecosystem in terms of a power structure that might be familiar, say, to C. Wright Mills, the famous sociologist who wrote The Power Elite back in 1960, you have these investors at the top, and then you have the state or the government in the middle. You have big tech coming in, but not really in the power structure. You have the real estate developers who are producing the space, the land for the companies. And then you have all of these public-private, non-profit partnerships that bring universities into the picture. And then you have the founders and very highly paid software engineers. And then you have everybody else who does some kind of tech job or who might be a computer science student. So you asked what a sociologist does. This is what a sociologist does after walking around the city. So then, many years ago, actually, in my book, The Cultures of Cities, I asked, who's culture, who's city? And now I ask, who's tech, who's city? What's going on? Who has the power? And what are they using it for? When we walk around, we see all these places where Amazon is implanted. We see empty storefronts because people are shopping online. And we see the congested streets, congested with deliveries coming to our homes. So that's my interpretation of the innovation complex in New York. Thanks so much for listening. Oh, I hope so. Yes.
I have a question on human rights.
Human rights?
On human rights, yeah. The question I have is, whenever we think of, I come from India, so smart cities are a very big deal, and of course smart city with the current Indian government means surveillance, and not in a nice sense of the term at all. So I'm just curious about what kind of human rights protections can be built into cities, given that the phone knows where we are, my Fitbit knows what I'm doing. How is the data shared? I mean, in these innovation hubs that are being planned across the US, are there human rights protections built in? I mean, particularly things like facial recognition being another one of those.
Number one, this is a fantastically important question that you raised. Number two, the question is being thought out every day, every minute, in every city and every country on different geographical, territorial levels. What we see in New York is not just all the politics of homelessness, affordable housing, transportation, the subway, education, everything, but we also see just within the tech space, every day the city council is trying to deal with the very issues that you raised. Every day there is some issue of the use of facial recognition technology in public schools. Another issue where residential tenants won a court case so far that requires their landlord to continue to give them physical keys, not just digital keys, because the digital keys permit surveillance of who goes in and who comes out. You may have read about that AI company, Clearview AI, the police, not just in New York, but all over, they use the facial recognition technology of that company. That company is based in New York. So the question of controlling technology, controlling innovation, is huge, and it's so fast. We can't keep up with it. Our elected officials, no matter how smart they may be, they can't deal with everything else, plus these issues that come up every minute. So I can't answer your question because it is constantly being fought out. Period. I mean, it's a great, that is really just one of the existential questions about it.
A lot of interesting issues that I had never really thought about.
Oh, thank goodness. I'm so happy to hear that.
And I study this stuff myself. But one thing you didn't talk about was demography. And the demography of the city and the way it's changing and the kinds of people that we have here. I am absolutely fascinated by the younger generation, particularly in Queens, where I live. Where in many parts of Queens, you meet people under 40, I call them post-racist. They are getting along with other people so well. And they're going into businesses with one another. There are so many fusion restaurants now where they're taking one cuisine and mixing it with another cuisine, and I think the same thing is happening in the small tech businesses. There is a kind of fusion of new ideas of young people who are coming from different cultures. It's happening in this city because this was the immigrant center, and it's because it's such a dense city, and because the kids are coming together in so many different ways that I think New York is very special because of that, and I didn't hear you mention it.
You're right, and I'm not surprised to hear you say that based on our very interesting conversation last week at Hilltop. New York's tech workforce is somewhat more diverse than the tech workforce of most other places. And that is, you can look at that in different ways. You looked at it, in one celebratory way for new ideas and so on, which is correct. Another way to look at it is that it's an advantage for New York that people can feel free to be here, no matter who they are, where they come from. You can also look at it in terms of tech lobbying, the tech industry lobbying, which they do, again, on every territorial level, for more immigration, or at least not to stop immigration, not to reduce immigration, because the flow of ideas, the flow of people are very necessary. Sure. Yeah. Please.
Really enjoyed your talk, and you painted a very positive picture of the trends that we described as we were observing. As this has been a very good thing for New York and other places, but there's a dark side, and you didn't comment on the dark side.
This is the first time I've ever been accused of not commenting on the dark side of something. That's another thing that sociologists do. We're always on the dark side.
It's not a criticism.
That's
but I think we should all recognize that there is a dark side to this. And the one that I'm thinking about is, you alluded to the demographics, there's a certain kind of new worker attracted to urban life, young people, tech people, knowledge workers, and companies are meeting the challenge in terms of employment, creating jobs. Okay? But the constraint on the growth of this golden egg is also real estate driven. It's the housing shortage and the price of housing. What we use this term affordable housing, I don't know what that means. It's a ridiculous term. But the people who are attracted to take these jobs, okay, are going to be squeezed out. And to say nothing of the people who live here already, but don't work in these industries and don't qualify to work in these industries. Where are they going to live? we need those people. Right? We need all of the support people to help fuel this growth and allow this wonderland to thrive. This is cultures colliding. How are we going to deal with that?
Don't know. But this is another extremely important question. I talk a little bit about this in the book, but I do not think that New York is in exactly the same causal process that San Francisco is. I'll tell you why. First of all, we're a lot bigger and have a bigger real estate housing market, but also because we have far richer people and higher income people that are driving the real estate developers to develop expensive housing. Let me circle around that. The process that you're describing very well is not necessarily connected to tech. It could be connected to the infusion, the flow of huge amounts of wealth into housing markets from any place. In San Francisco, a lot of the wealth that has come into housing markets in recent years comes from tech, from people exercising their stock options, IPOs and so on. The primary residence of a lot of tech executives, founders, is in the San Francisco Bay Area and Silicon Valley. A lot of the high end of the real estate market in New York City is driven by the financial industry people. As venture capitalists said to me when I interviewed them, we're not rich, it's the equity guys, they're rich. Okay, everything's relative, but it's true. I mean, the person who paid $238 million for an apartment, the largest sale price ever, he's a financial guy, he's not a tech guy. And if you look around at the museums, the biggest philanthropists with the biggest egos who plaster their names on their physical donations are the financial guys. They're not the tech people, they're not the tech companies. I'm not saying tech is great, they're modest, they don't make money. I'm not saying that at all. But I am saying that in New York, the wealth that has flooded into the real estate markets in recent years, since the 1980s, has been international investors at different levels. And financial people and media executives, Rupert Murdoch types, and celebrities. You know, I don't usually run around talking about celebrities, but if you have, a couple that earns a lot of money, like Jay-Z and Beyonce, they have houses in various places. They have an apartment in Tribeca. You have people who earn a lot of money in the film industry or the music industry. Well, they have to have an apartment in New York. So, and they have apartments or houses in other places too, but we have a lot of very rich people, both investors and consumers and high income people who buy into the housing market here in New York City.
Well, and they also buy into the housing market because it's a good investment.
Well, that also, yeah. And people do that in San Francisco too, but that's where you have more tech-rich people. So, but I agree with you that there are higher earning people in these economic development strategies and educational strategies of the de Blasio administration. I'm not trying to defend any administration here, but the de Blasio administration has invested in CUNY programs and also boot camp programs and nonprofit classes to train what I call in the book native New Yorkers to do tech jobs, to move from a job that might pay them $20,000, $35,000 a year to one that might pay them $85,000 a year. But those are people who are envisioned as coming from the city, moving up in the city. So, when people ask me if I'm writing about tech and gentrification, which is sort of what you were asking, but you asked in a much more sophisticated way, and I thank you for that. I always say, no, I'm not writing about tech and gentrification because I don't see that tech is driving gentrification.
So
Yeah.
can I add an
Sure.
addendum and an idea to that? Because I think in answer to your question, my perspective as a historian, architecture historian, but an urban historian, is that real estate is the ultimate business of New York.
Yes.
Right?
It has been.
And it has been since the first deal with the colonialists and the Dutch investors. So I would argue that those buildings, whether they're old lofts now not being pioneered by artists who are taking them because of low prices, but now middle prices where businesses, which is a higher and better use than residence, gives more value to that real estate. That those buildings have been there, some of them for 100 years. And new buildings are being created, but ultimately it's whatever the value of the land is, the desire to be in New York, and therefore the simplicity of not wanting to be in New York in the 1970s, but wanting to through the whichever decade you're talking about. That it's the physical fabric of New York and the desire of people to be there and to pay the money to be there that drives the kind of ultimate economy of Manhattan, and we're the insects that occupy the spaces, and the worker bees, or the whatever, the ant farm of all of the changing populations.
Well, that's what you pointed out so well in your book, contrasting Chicago and New York as generators of skyscraper design, that the land has always been so valuable in New York. And even more than people who want to be here are people, as you suggest, who want to invest here. So, San Francisco sees that too. Hong Kong, London, my God, every big city has seen these various kinds of transnational investment in real estate. So it's not, it's not just tech, but it's sort of like the first question, how do you control this? You need a whole set of regulations to document this, because we don't even have good government records, city government records that document who owns even individual apartments. We just don't have that, because people can shelter their names, protect their identities, even despite surveillance, by buying real estate in a corporate name. So it's very difficult to find out who actually owns different spaces. But I agree with you entirely, and I see affordable housing. I agree with you. We don't know what that is. I see affordable housing as the exotic other of luxury housing, in a funny way that they are both locked in some sort of spiral.
Is there one bright question to ask? One bright side question?
But I'm used to hear that I seem to be presenting the bright side, because the book, I think, is about the dark side. Yesterday I was telling Carol Willis about this before. Yesterday I spoke with someone who was very experienced writing about business in New York, and he said, I read your book, I disagree with you entirely, and so I'm looking for the golden balance, the golden mean between totally critical and, I don't know. I want us to have jobs in New York. Emma, please.
So I think there are a number of themes that you've talked about, and you keep saying the tech. I'm trying to separate. The tech revolution, we do need to worry about surveillance and all of that. A part of this is just New York has reinvented itself many times. Is this really that different that all of a sudden, some new thing has sprung up here, and cities are in, and we're both benefiting and suffering from people want to live where there are other people like them and they don't need mass transit and whatever. That's not about tech as much, but it nurtured tech because that's what young people want to do here. And I remind you, we keep talking about New York. It's actually, I think most of the time we're talking about Manhattan and the coast, so to speak, of Queens and Brooklyn. It's a big city. There's lots of affordable housing. There's lots of other things within the city. So if you look at the super luxury, it's tiny compared to the overall amount of housing.
It's
so
hard.
Just putting it, I'm not going to argue with you what its impact, but putting it in perspective, I think is.
Yes, of course you're right that the most expensive real estate is still in Manhattan. Brooklyn is the housing prices have increased faster in Brooklyn. You know that investors have been investing in the Bronx for years. Queens, the development of Sunnyside Yards in Queens, and now Long Island City. I remember in the 1980s, and some of you may remember, some of you were not born in the 1980s, but others of you may also remember in the 1980s when the interior design building was placed in Long Island City, and it wasn't successful, even though whoever operated the building ran a shuttle between the design architects and design center near Bloomingdale's and Long Island City. People didn't want to go there. It was like inconceivably far to go to Long Island City to visit design product showrooms. But how many years later, 30 years later, 35 years later, Long Island City, real estate market, it's hot, a lot of people want to live there.
When Citibank put up that tower, that was Siberia.
That's right.
Now it would have been the belly button of the new Amazon market.
That's right.
Yeah. May yet be. I don't think we've heard the last chapter.
We'll see. Please.
Yeah, I guess it's just a follow-up to all these things that people were bringing up about reinvention and how New York has pretty much pivoted in some ways from being known as what was still known as the financial center of the world, but now being thought of in the second being as secondary tech capital in the U.S. I guess my question is more around, clearly, I think the backlash against Amazon is sort of an indication that many citizens have seen that New York has almost done too good of a job at nurturing tech in some ways, and then why are we still giving subsidies to tech at this point when it's already become this behemoth? And I think, I'm just curious what you think about, if there are limited resources, should New York still be giving subsidies to tech as opposed to in comparison to other types of industries? And has there been backlash from other industries wondering where's my slice of the pie? And if that's the case where we do start to take back these sort of subsidies and support for tech, where does that money go? What are the new industries and fields that we do go on and to nurture going forward?
To be totally simplistic about it, maybe we can say there are good subsidies and bad subsidies, or subsidies given for good purposes and subsidies given for bad or irrelevant purposes. Myself, I do not, and on the basis of what I have read of research on the effects of the efficacy of locational subsidies, I do not think that individual companies should be given any government subsidies whatsoever. So locational subsidies, I would abolish. It's hard to do politically, but I would abolish them. And every kind of research that I have seen says that most of them, not all, I'm trying to save myself from being attacked, most of them are not effective, locational subsidies. So I would not do that, but I do think that there are good subsidies in terms of education. Who's going to educate a workforce these days when the norm, the ideology is still to have mean corporations who do not invest in their workers? It's the government that has to educate people so that they can get jobs. So I think the government has to put more money into education, more money into transportation and housing, so that the workforce can biologically and socially reproduce, be alive, right, and live decently. I think the government should just try to make some sort of revolutionary statement. In New York, should make a revolutionary statement that we are not going to give subsidies anymore. I know that some of the opponents of Amazon, who are disrespectfully called Amazon slayers by some of the media platforms, they are trying to get new laws passed in the state legislature that would either reduce or abolish many, if not all, locational subsidies. Whether they will succeed, we don't know. Or whether they will only succeed in making subsidies more, quote, transparent, and who knows what that means. I don't know, but I'd like to see subsidies to companies eliminated completely. There's just so much need for, there's so many needs that government should support. I don't think subsidies to companies are one of those needs.
So I think investing in education is about as sunny a conclusion as we can bring to the discussion today. And we usually conclude by 8 o'clock. We do have a reception. We do have books if you want to get a book and a signed book. They're either up here or down in the store. And there's some wine and water, and you can continue to ask individual questions to Sharon after we thank her.
Thank you.
Come back in April when we'll have a talk by a former resident of Tudor City about Tudor City, which is the building in that case right there in the housing density show. And I hope you have time to look around the show a little bit so you can get a sense of this exhibition, which comes down in just 2 weeks now, and then we'll have Super Tall. So at the museum we try to do a whole range of topics for our book talks, and as well as for our exhibitions on New York City history, on world, I suppose global capitalism as a matter of fact, especially as exhibited in Super Tall Skyscrapers, which is our next exhibition. So please keep your eye on our website, and we'll see what else we have to do, or sign up for our newsletter so that you'll be apprised of all the different events that we have. So tonight we have, and fortunately last week we had Sharon with us to listen in, but now we have tonight Sharon Zukin, a sociologist, professor of sociology from now emerita from Brooklyn College, having just retired the gown or the cap last semester, I guess. And also at the Graduate Center at CUNY, where she still oversees the work of graduate students. A person who has studied cities from many different perspectives as exhibit, and over quite a few decades, as a matter of fact, because I had to look up the dates of publication of your previous books, all of which I knew in a kind of glancing way, I have to admit. So if we look at the titles of her books from 1989, Loft Living, these are all mostly about New York, but not entirely. So really kind of on the invention of loft living, when in my world of architectural history, lofts meant something entirely different in manufacturing spaces. In 1993, Landscapes of Power, which was a more American survey. In 1996, The Culture of Cities, both of which of those books I know had a Georgia O'Keeffe painting on the cover, so very attractive to the eye, and one of my favorite painters. In 2011, there was probably something in between, but in 2011, Naked City, The Death and Life of Authentic Urban Places, and now in just this year, The Innovation Complex, Cities, Tech, and the New Economy. You can see in those titles a kind of trajectory of New York's shifting history and shifting sectors of the economy, the kind of rise and fall of the fortunes of New York and the changing sectors of work. Sharon, as a sociologist, has many awards, has taught in, taught in many universities. She's given many speeches and featured keynote addresses, and and has won awards for her books. So I'm telling you that her academic credentials are many, and I'm going to also ask her a really simple question to ask to start her talk, and that is, before you start to talk about what is now our kind of preoccupation of the moment with the innovation complex. I mean, the moment being Super Tuesday and Michael Bloomberg being one of the names on the international ballot, and one of the innovators of this complexity that took hold in New York, and certainly a landscape of power in the history of New York.